welcome to Bible Tank. I'm Kennedy, and we narrate powerful testimonies from around the world, stories of raptures, end times, near-death experiences, and encounters with angels, demons, Satan, God, and Jesus Christ. If you enjoy stories like these, consider subscribing to our channel. We'd also love to hear your thoughts. Share them in the comments below. If you have personal testimonies, visions, or revelations from God to share, feel free to send them to us via our email address in the description below. We will be honored to read your story, which could inspire, uplift, and encourage others in their faith journey with Jesus Christ. Now, let's get started.
She was only 10, a bright and spirited girl who loved painting sunsets and singing worship songs. I can still picture her tiny hands carefully guiding the brush as she hummed her favorite hymns, her eyes wide with innocence and joy. We homeschooled her, so our house was always filled with laughter, music, and the chatter of Bible lessons. Life was peaceful until the dreams began. It was late spring, the air still crisp with the freshness of new blossoms. That night, she came running to my room, her small frame shaking. "Daddy," she said, her voice barely a whisper. I had a bad dream. Her face was pale, eyes wide and wet with tears. I held her close, whispering reassurances, but inside, a chill ran down my spine. She began to tell me about the first dream. It started in a vast, open square, filled with a crowd waving flags and cheering. She described it with the detail of an artist, the colors so vivid in her mind, red, white, and gold banners rippling in a gentle breeze. At the center of it all was a man, standing tall and commanding attention. He looked old, with white hair and a warm, grandfatherly face. Dressed in a flowing white robe, he had an aura of kindness that drew the crowd closer. They cheered and shouted his name, hanging onto his every word. But then, everything changed. She saw his eyes. The soft blue of a kind old man's eyes darkened to black, deep as night. His expression twisted, and his voice became a booming roar, reverberating through the square. He declared himself the Savior, the true Messiah, and the crowd fell silent, dropping to their knees in unison. It was as if a dark spell had overtaken them, and they worshipped him in stunned awe. The ground beneath her feet began to shake violently. An earthquake ripped through the square, and from the cracks in the earth, flames shot up, licking the air like the tongues of a hungry beast. The old man's smile grew sinister as he turned his gaze toward her, his steps slow and deliberate, closing the distance between them. She wanted to scream, but no sound would come. The flames grew closer, and the ground seemed to crumble beneath her. Then, with a start, she woke up, drenched in sweat. I listened, stunned and unnerved. I told myself it was just a nightmare, a product of a young girl's imagination, but deep down, something didn't feel right. I saw fear in her eyes that I couldn't shake. A few days later, we were watching the evening news when she suddenly froze. Her face went pale and she pointed at the screen. There, in a photograph, was the Pope waving to a crowd in Rome. Her eyes widened with terror. "Daddy, that's him," she said, her voice barely audible. "That's the man from my dream." My breath caught. I didn't know what to say. This couldn't be happening. Could it? I tried to calm her, to tell her it was just a dream. But that night, when I tucked her in, I could feel the weight of those words pressing on my chest. A darkness had settled over our home, and I knew, somehow, that this was only the beginning. A week passed, and I prayed those dreams were over. Yet my daughter's unease only deepened. She was quieter, her joyful singing replaced by nervous glances and a shadow that lingered in her eyes. One evening, she tugged at my sleeve, her voice barely louder than a whisper. "Daddy, I dreamed again." This time, she found herself standing inside a massive cathedral, unlike anything she had ever seen before. She described the cathedral's soaring arches, towering stained glass windows, and marble floors that gleamed like polished mirrors. The air was heavy with the scent of incense, and 1,000 candles flickered along the walls, casting dancing shadows. There was a strange peace there, but it was the kind that prickled her skin, a silence that felt too deep, too still. She walked forward, drawn by the echo of distant voices. In the center of the cathedral, she saw him again, the old man, now seated upon an elaborate golden throne. His face was serene, his white robe spotless, and in his hand, he held a silver staff, topped with a twisted emblem that seemed to pulse with a dull, dark light. Surrounding him were men and women, praying, not to Jesus but to him. Their voices rose in unison, a chant that filled the space with a suffocating reverence. The man lifted his staff, his face radiating power. His eyes, still that unnerving shade of black, glinted with something terrible. "I have come," he announced, "to build the temple of the new covenant, a place of unity and peace." The crowd erupted into cheers, and a strange glow enveloped the room. But my daughter said she could feel a dark force behind those words, something twisted and wrong. It was as if the very walls of the cathedral were alive, breathing with a silent, sinister intent. Then things began to change. The candles flickered violently, the peaceful air giving way to a suffocating heaviness. Her heart pounded in her chest, and the light from the stained glass dimmed, bathing the room in a sickly hue. The people around her began to weep, their faces contorting in anguish as they lifted their hands toward the man on the throne. She felt frozen, her feet rooted to the cold marble floor as she watched him stand, raising the staff high above his head. The chant grew louder, a terrible, discordant symphony that made her ears ring. Suddenly, he looked straight at her. A slow, wicked smile spread across his face as if he had known she was there all along. Her legs moved on their own, backing away, desperate to escape, but there was nowhere to go. With a resounding crack, the floor split open, and from the gaping fissures, an unearthly cold radiated out, pulling her toward the man and his throne of power. "No!" she screamed, but the voices around her drowned her out. The crowd, now chanting even louder, surged forward, pressing closer to the old man. In that terrifying moment, she snapped awake, gasping for air, her heart pounding as if it would burst from her chest. She was shaking as she recounted the dream to me, her eyes wide with terror. "Daddy, they weren't praying to Jesus. They were praying to him," she said, her voice breaking. I tried to hold her, to offer comfort, but what could I say? The dark figure she described sounded so familiar, yet so unimaginable at the same time. I wanted to believe it was all just a child's nightmare. Too many late-night stories, perhaps. But deep down, I couldn't dismiss the fear that gripped my own heart. These dreams were more than imagination. They were warnings. My daughter's vivid recounting of the man, the cathedral, the strange prophecy. Everything felt too real to ignore. As I listened, chills crawled up my spine. She had seen something that made her innocent joy fade into fearful silence, and I feared that whatever she was seeing would not stop until its message was fully revealed. The next few nights, I stayed up late, praying over her room, pleading for God's protection. But the dreams didn't stop. They were just beginning. The third dream struck with a ferocity that left her trembling. It was midnight when she woke me, her small hands clutching my arm, her face pale as moonlight. I could barely get her to speak. When she finally did, her voice was a thin, broken whisper. "This time," she said, "the dream began in a bustling city, one she didn't recognize but felt oddly familiar. The sky was a dull, lifeless gray, and the streets were filled with people moving as if in a trance, their eyes vacant, their steps heavy. On every building, massive screens flashed the face of the man she had seen before, the one who had sat on the throne in the cathedral, now smiling with a calculated kindness. He was speaking, his voice echoing through the air. "Come forward, people of the world. The mark is your sign of unity, of progress, of peace." She saw crowds lining up, shuffling towards a series of booths that stretched endlessly down the city streets. Each booth bore the same emblem she had seen on the staff in the cathedral, a twisted, dark design that seemed to move like a living thing. The people's faces showed no fear, no hesitation, only a quiet, resigned acceptance. As she watched, she saw those who received the mark. They wore it on their right hands, a black and red symbol that glowed with a faint light. Those who bore it seemed to move with a new sense of purpose, eyes bright with a strange fervor. But there were others, people who shook their heads, backing away from the booths. Their faces were full of desperate defiance. She saw them dragged away by dark figures in black robes, their movements swift and cold, shadows swallowing them whole. Her eyes welled up as she described the way the unmarked were taken, forced into black vans, disappearing into the gray fog that covered the city. She tried to follow them, running through the streets, but her feet felt like lead. Each step was slower than the last, the grayness around her thickening into a suffocating mist. She turned a corner, and there he was, the man from her dreams, standing at the end of an empty alley. His eyes, black as before, locked onto hers. "You can't hide from the truth," he said, his voice soft and almost tender, yet it carried a cold weight that left her frozen in place. He raised his hand, showing her the mark. "This is your future." She wanted to scream, to run, but she couldn't move. The gray mist tightened around her, and all she could see were those dark eyes and that terrible mark glowing in the shadows. Then, as if from nowhere, a blinding light split the darkness, piercing through the fog like a sword. The figures in black robes turned and fled, vanishing into the shadows, and the man in the alley began to fade, his form unraveling into the gray nothingness. The light grew brighter until it was all she could see. And then, she woke up, gasping for breath, tears streaming down her face. When she finished recounting the dream, I felt a wave of helplessness. What could I do to protect her from these visions? What did they mean? I hugged her tightly, but she remained rigid, staring blankly ahead as if she were still trapped in that dark, foggy city. "Daddy," she said quietly, "they were giving the mark to everyone. You couldn't do anything without it. And the people, they were so different afterward. It was like they weren't themselves anymore." I didn't have answers, but I tried to reassure her the best I could. "It's just a dream, sweetheart. God is with us. He'll protect us." But the words felt hollow in my mouth, the weight of her dreams settling heavily on my shoulders. As the days passed, she became more withdrawn, her eyes haunted by the images she saw each night. I watched her change, growing quieter, as if the brightness of her spirit was being swallowed by a shadow only she could see. I kept praying, but the dreams wouldn't let up. Then came the fourth dream, and it was the darkest yet. The fourth dream shattered whatever sense of normalcy we had left. It was a cold, quiet evening when my daughter's terrified screams pulled me out of sleep. I rushed to her room, and there she was, huddled under her blankets, her body shaking like a leaf caught in a storm. It took a long while to calm her down, and when she spoke, her voice was hoarse, barely audible. She told me what she had seen, and I felt the chill of her words settle deep into my bones. In her dream, she stood in an enormous hall, the ceiling so high it disappeared into darkness. The walls were lined with somber drapes, and at the far end of the room lay an open coffin. A great crowd filled the space, their faces sorrowful and silent, as if witnessing the funeral of someone beloved. And there, lying in the coffin, was the man, the same man who had haunted her dreams, the one who had sat on the golden throne in the cathedral. His face was peaceful, almost serene, but she could sense a strange anticipation in the air. It felt like the entire world was holding its breath. 3 days passed in the blink of an eye. She said she could feel every second, each heartbeat a dreadful countdown. Then, without warning, his eyes snapped open. The crowd gasped, their sorrow transforming into wild, unrestrained joy. He rose from the coffin, his entire body glowing with a sickly, unholy radiance. It wasn't a light that comforted. It was a light that burned, that twisted everything it touched. He raised his hands high, a triumphant smile spreading across his face, and the crowd fell to their knees. "I am the Savior," he declared, his voice reverberating through the hall like thunder. "I have conquered death. Follow me, and you shall have life." The people wept, reaching out to touch the hems of his robes. It was as if they had forgotten everything they had ever known about the truth, the Bible, and the real Savior. They were utterly captivated, blinded by his false light. My daughter's voice quivered as she described the sight. She felt an overwhelming sorrow, a despair that clawed at her heart. She tried to run, but something held her in place, forcing her to watch as the man's lie spread through the crowd like wildfire. Then the room darkened, and the air grew thick and heavy. My daughter saw people lining up to pledge their loyalty to him, offering their allegiance with fervent cries. Suddenly, he looked straight at her, just as he had before, his black eyes drilling into her soul. "You cannot hide," he said, that twisted smile still playing on his lips. "I am everything you need." She couldn't move. The ground beneath her began to tremble, shaking with a violence that seemed to echo her own terror. Fire erupted from beneath, licking at the edges of the hall, and the glowing man began to laugh, a deep, guttural sound that rattled her very bones. Just as the flames threatened to consume her, a voice, gentle and pure, called her name. It was the only warmth in the freezing darkness, the only light in that false brilliance. A sudden gust of wind blew through the hall, extinguishing the fire, and the man's form wavered, flickering like a dying flame. The dream faded, and she woke, drenched in cold sweat, her hands clawing at the sheets as if trying to escape something unseen. She was inconsolable, shaking uncontrollably in my arms. "Daddy, he's going to fool them all," she cried. "They don't see what he really is. They believe him." Her words hung heavy in the room, and I could do nothing but hold her and pray, my mind racing with fear and confusion. I didn't understand the dreams, but I knew they were not just the fantasies of a child's overactive imagination. Her fear was real, her sorrow was real, and whatever darkness she had seen, I couldn't deny that it was drawing closer, inch by inch. The weeks that followed were a blur. My daughter's once bright smile became a rarity, her days filled with uneasy silence. I tried to keep life normal, encouraging her to paint, play, and listen to her favorite worship songs. But something in her had changed, a piece of innocence lost to the shadows of those dreams. And then the fifth dream came, a vision of a world not far off, a world ruled by a sinister order, a darkness that had taken root in the hearts of men. The fifth dream came with an urgency, a deep sense of dread that left her breathless. She told me about it the next morning, her voice flat and weary, as though she were describing a nightmare that had bled into reality. In this dream, she found herself overlooking a world divided, each region a distinct piece of a twisted puzzle. She saw vast maps stretched across endless walls, each marked with strange symbols and borders that didn't look like any she'd seen in her geography lessons. The world was now divided into 10 regions, each ruled by a king. Yet these kings weren't truly in charge. They were nothing more than puppets, obedient to the one she had seen so many times before, the man with dark eyes who sat in the highest seat. From her viewpoint, she watched as the leaders gathered before him, each king kneeling to receive orders. The man's gaze pierced through them all, his smile cold and distant as he held his staff, the same symbol of authority she had seen in the cathedral, now glowing with an ominous red light. He held absolute control, and the kings obeyed without question, like puppets pulled by invisible strings. As she watched, the world around her shifted, revealing a city unlike any she'd seen, a dark metropolis of towering steel and blinding lights. There were checkpoints at every corner, shadowy guards monitoring every move. People walked the streets with hollow faces, each one bearing the mark she had seen before, the dark emblem etched onto their right hands. Every aspect of life seemed controlled, regulated, and stripped of freedom. She felt the weight of oppression, the sense of souls bound in invisible chains, and her heart ached with a sorrow she could hardly express. She moved through the city, feeling the chilling reality of this new world. She tried to speak to people, but they only glanced at her with empty eyes, their faces devoid of any warmth or recognition. She watched them stand in line for food, unable to buy or sell without showing their mark. Families were separated, friends torn apart, lives dictated by forces beyond their control. The atmosphere was one of fear and obedience, a silent submission to a power that allowed no dissent. As she continued to wander, she came to a barrier, a vast wall blocking her path. Beyond it, she could see lush landscapes, hills rolling into the distance, untouched by the darkness that shrouded the city. She knew instinctively that this was a forbidden land, a place where those without the mark were banished. She sensed that there were others like her, people who had resisted, who had refused to take the mark despite the consequences. But they were isolated, cut off from society, forced to live in the shadows, barely surviving. Her heart pounded as she felt a sudden urge to escape, to reach the freedom that lay beyond that wall. But just as she approached, a figure stepped in her path. It was him, the man with the dark eyes, his face calm but with a hint of amusement as he watched her struggle. "There is no escape," he said softly, his voice a venomous whisper. "You belong to me now, as does everyone else." The world seemed to close in on her, the walls pressing tight, the weight of his words settling over her like a suffocating shroud. She looked around, realizing the hopelessness that gripped the city, the bleakness that had consumed its people. They had given up everything, their freedom, their souls, all for the promise of unity and peace. Then she saw something that struck her to the core. A small family was huddled together near the edge of the city. A father, mother, and their young child, each looking weary but determined. They were without the mark, their clothes tattered, their eyes weary but defiant. She saw a guard approach, his face hidden under a dark hood, and the family tensed, holding each other close. The guard raised his hand, preparing to strike, and my daughter cried out, feeling the family's fear as if it were her own. At that moment, she felt a flash of light, a fierce warmth that seemed to come from deep within her. The man's face contorted with anger, his voice booming, "You cannot change what is destined." The city began to crumble, the ground shaking beneath her feet, and as she fell, her vision blurred, the world around her fading into darkness. She woke with a start, her hands gripping her sheets, her heart pounding. There was a gravity in her eyes, a weight I hadn't seen before. She looked at me with a mixture of fear and determination, as if she had witnessed not just a dream, but a glimpse of a reality yet to come. "They're controlling everything, Daddy," she whispered, her voice trembling. "And people don't even know they're trapped. They think they're free, but they're not." I held her, trying to soothe her, though I felt the chill of her words sink deep into my own soul. These dreams weren't just visions. They were warnings, signs of something dark and looming, something we could barely comprehend. I didn't know what lay ahead, but I knew one thing. The last dream came like a storm, swift, fierce, and inescapable. My daughter's eyes were wide and glazed when she woke me that night, her hands gripping my arm so tight it hurt. "This dream," she said, "was unlike any she'd had before. It wasn't just a vision. It was an all-consuming experience that left her trembling and breathless." She found herself standing on a vast battlefield, the earth beneath her feet scorched and barren. A cold wind swept through, carrying with it the scent of ash and smoke. In the distance, she saw two armies facing each other, a sea of black shadows on one side and figures dressed in gleaming white armor on the other. The contrast was stark, and the tension in the air was almost unbearable. The sun was hidden behind dark clouds, casting an eerie glow over the scene, as if the very sky held its breath. At the center of the blackened horde stood the man she had seen so many times before, the one with the dark eyes and the grandfatherly face. He had changed yet again. Now, his figure was shrouded in an unholy radiance, glowing with a twisted, pale light that seemed to ripple with power. His voice echoed across the battlefield, commanding his followers with a presence that demanded absolute obedience. They were no longer mere humans. They were consumed, hollowed out, shadows of the people they had once been, each one bearing the mark on their hands. On the opposite side, she saw the army of saints, their faces calm and resolute, their eyes fixed on a single figure riding a brilliant white horse. The man on the horse was unlike anyone she had seen before. his presence overwhelming and majestic. He was dressed in a white robe dipped in blood, and a sharp sword gleamed from his mouth. His eyes blazed like fire, and a crown of many diadems rested upon his brow. The sight of him filled her with awe and an unexplainable comfort, even in the face of such impending doom. She knew, without a doubt, that this was Jesus, the true king, the one who had come to end the darkness. The battle began with a single command from the Dark Leader, his followers charging forward like a tidal wave of darkness. The earth shook, and the sound of war cries filled the air. The saints responded, their swords flashing as they moved forward, a brilliant light pushing back the shadows with every step. My daughter watched, paralyzed by the sheer intensity of the conflict, the clash of forces almost blinding in its ferocity. Then, in a single, swift movement, the man on the white horse raised his sword. A blinding light shot from its edge, and the world seemed to hold its breath. In that instant, the darkness recoiled, shuddering as if struck by a force it could not withstand. The man with the dark eyes screamed, his voice a blend of rage and terror as the light enveloped him, consuming his very being. The dark army fell back, disintegrating into ashes as the light spread, purging the battlefield of every trace of evil. It was over in a heartbeat. The light faded, and all that remained was a gentle, peaceful glow that settled over the field. My daughter saw the faces of the saints, their expressions of relief and joy, tears streaming down their cheeks as they knelt before the one who had saved them. The figure on the white horse turned, and for a moment, his eyes met hers. They were filled with a love so deep and pure it took her breath away. And the scene shifted suddenly. She was no longer on the battlefield but in a radiant, golden city, a place of unimaginable beauty and light. There were trees bearing fruit of every kind, rivers of crystal clear water, and streets that shone like polished gold. The air was filled with the sound of joyous singing, voices raised in eternal praise. She saw children laughing, people embracing, a place where every tear had been wiped away. It was heaven. She knew that instantly, a place untouched by pain or sorrow, a home for those who had persevered. But then, she felt a pull, a sudden shift, and she was back in her bed, staring at the ceiling, her heart racing. Her eyes were filled with tears, tears of relief, of joy, and of sadness all at once. She knew that the dreams had come to an end, that the final message had been delivered. She looked at, "Daddy, he's coming soon. We need to be ready." There was no fear in her voice now, only a quiet, unwavering conviction. I sat beside her, holding her hand as she drifted back to sleep, the remnants of her vision lingering in the stillness of the room. The dreams had changed everything for us, reshaping our understanding, shifting our priorities, grounding us in a reality that went beyond the everyday. I felt a deep sense of urgency, a call to be vigilant, to hold fast to the truth, and to prepare for what lay ahead. This testimony, this journey we had walked through together, wasn't just about warning. It was about hope, a hope that remained unshaken even in the face of darkness. And as I closed my eyes that night, I prayed with a fierceness I hadn't known before, asking God for guidance, for strength, and for the courage to face whatever the future held. We were not alone. The light would come, and when it did, it would drive out every shadow, every lie, until all that remained was the truth, the everlasting, unchanging truth.
Thank you so much for watching and walking through this intense journey with us. The girl's dreams are a powerful reminder that we live in crucial times where the lines between truth and deception are clearer than ever before. These dreams weren't just a warning, but a message of hope, one that urges us to be ready, to stay vigilant, and to cling to the light that overcomes the darkness. If this story touched you or gave you something to think about, please subscribe to the channel, hit that like button, and share it with friends and family who might need to hear this message. Don't forget to click the notification bell so you won't miss future videos filled with testimonies, insights, and stories that inspire faith and vigilance. Stay blessed, and remember, He's coming soon. Let's be ready together.